The mess hall doors slammed shut behind her, and Lance Nake Babar Sheik still had his hand wrapped around her arm. "I told you already," he said, voice low but hard. "This hall is closed to outside personnel during senior briefing hours. You don't have a pass, you don't have a name tape, you don't have anything. Out." She didn't fight him, she didn't raise her voice. She just looked at him with eyes that didn't blink, the kind of calm that made the hair on his neck stand up even though he couldn't say why. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "I've heard that before," Babar said and pushed the door wider. Outside, the wind off the harbor smelled like diesel and salt, the way it always did at Manora this time of evening, when the tide pulled back and left the mudflats exposed and stinking under an orange sky. She stepped out into it without complaint, straightened her plain green field jacket, and walked away into the dark without looking back once. Babar didn't think about her again for almost 4 hours. That's how little he knew. Before we go further, if you're watching this from somewhere far from home tonight, drop where you're watching from in the comments. I want to know. And if stories like this one mean something to you, stay till the end, then hit subscribe. This one's worth staying for. Babar Sheik had been at the Manora base for 2 years, ever since the posting came through that put him under Pakistan Marines instead of the regular Coastal Guard unit he'd trained with. He liked the discipline of it. He liked that there were rules for everything, because rules meant nobody had to guess, and guessing was what got people killed. He'd learned that the hard way 18 months ago on a night patrol near the creek when his section commander Havildar Rashid had guessed that a fishing boat drifting too close to the checkpoint was just a fisherman lost in the fog. It wasn't. 3 men went into the water that night. Only 2 came back. Babar still heard Rashid's voice sometimes in the half-second before sleep telling him it would be fine. After that, Babar stopped guessing. He followed every rule like it was the only thing standing between him and another funeral. His friends teased him for it. His section mates called him inspector behind his back, not always kindly. He didn't care. Rules had a chain of command behind them, and the chain of command existed so that men like Rashid didn't have to make decisions alone in the dark with nothing but instinct and fog. So when a woman in a plain, unmarked field jacket walked into the senior mess hall 20 minutes before a closed-door briefing, with no escort, no name tape, and no explanation beyond, "I need to see Major Mahbub," Babar didn't hesitate. He didn't care how she carried herself, how calm her voice was, how oddly unbothered she seemed by being challenged. The chain of command said outsiders did not enter during a closed briefing, so he removed her. He didn't know yet that the chain of command that night started with her. Major Tariq Mahbub found out within the hour, and by the time he found Babar near the equipment shed, his face had the particular stillness of a man trying very hard not to shout in a place where people could hear him. "Do you understand what you did?" Mahbub said. It wasn't a question. "Sir, she had no pass, no escort. The hall was closed for the briefing. I followed standing orders." "Standing orders?" Mahbub repeated the words like they tasted bad. "Sheik, that was Major General Saima Raza, the new sector commander. She came in plain dress on purpose, without announcement, specifically to see how this base behaves when nobody is watching. And what she saw was one of my Marines grab her by the arm and throw her into the parking lot like a stray dog." Babar felt the blood leave his face. "Sir, I didn't know." "That's exactly the problem," Mahbub snapped. "You didn't know, and instead of finding out, you put your hands on a general officer. There's a difference between following procedure and manhandling someone because you've decided you already know the answer. You used force on a woman who hadn't raised her hand to you, hadn't threatened you, hadn't done anything except ask a question you didn't like the sound of. That's not discipline, Sheik. That's a temper with a uniform on." Babar opened his mouth and closed it again. There was nothing to say. He had grabbed her arm. He remembered the exact moment his hand closed around her sleeve, remembered the small flicker of surprise on her face, not at being challenged, but at being touched. "She wants to see you tomorrow morning, personally," Mahbub said. "I tell you to pray, but I don't think prayer is going to fix this one." That night, Babar lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling fan turning slow circles above him, and for the first time in 18 months, he wished he had guessed wrong instead of right. Major General Saima Raza's office was small for someone of her rank, just a desk, 2 chairs, a window that looked out over the gray water of the harbor channel where 2 patrol boats sat tied at the jetty. She didn't stand when Babar entered. She didn't return his salute right away either. She let him hold it a few seconds longer than was comfortable, watching him the same way she had watched him outside the mess hall door. "At ease," she said finally. "Sit." He sat. "You know who I am now?" "Yes, ma'am." "Tell me what you did wrong." Babar's jaw tightened. "I grabbed your arm, ma'am. I used force when I shouldn't have." "That's part of it," she said. "Tell me the rest." He hesitated. "I assumed you were lying, ma'am, about who you might be." You said something and I didn't believe you, and I didn't even consider that you might be telling the truth." She nodded slowly, like he'd passed some quiet test he didn't know he was taking. "Most men in your position would have apologized for stopping me at all," she said. "You haven't. Why?" "Because I wasn't wrong to stop you, ma'am. The hall was closed. You had no pass. If I let people through because they look confident enough to be believed, the rule means nothing." He paused. "I was wrong in how I did it, not that I did it." For a long moment she said nothing, just studied him the way someone studies a map before deciding which road to trust. "There was a breach at the eastern checkpoint at Korangi Creek 6 weeks ago," she said. "Smugglers, we think, maybe worse. They got close enough to photograph patrol patterns before anyone noticed. I came to Manora without announcement because I wanted to see if this base would fold the moment someone confident walked through the door without a pass. You didn't fold, Sheik. You put your hands where they shouldn't have gone, and that will be on your record, but you didn't fold." Babar said nothing. He didn't know if he was being forgiven or sentenced. "There will be a formal reprimand," she said. "Not a court-martial. Major Mabub wanted more, and frankly, he's not wrong to want it. You don't get to manhandle a senior officer and walk away with nothing, even if your instincts were right, but you'll stay on active duty. I want men like you on this coastline, not in a stockade." She finally looked directly at him. "Just learn the difference between holding a line and grabbing someone's arm to prove you can." "Yes, ma'am," Babar said, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in 2 years. He didn't tell her about Rashid. He didn't tell her about the fog or the boat or the 2 men who came back instead of 3. But she seemed somehow to already understand that his rigidity wasn't born from arrogance. It was born from a debt he was still trying to pay off, one rule at a time. The reprimand went on his file. His pay was docked for a month, a real loss for a man who sent half of every salary back to Ibrahim Haidari, where his mother lived with his younger sister, a girl named Sana who had 2 more years of school left and dreams of being a pharmacist. Babar's father had been a fisherman his whole life, until the sea took him during a storm when Babar was 16, and ever since, Babar had been the one standing between his family and the kind of poverty that swallowed fishing villages whole. A month's docked pay meant Sana's tuition would be late. It meant his mother would have to ask a neighbor for a loan again, the way she had the year his father died. Babar carried that weight quietly, the way he carried most things. Word spread around the base anyway, the way it always does. Some Marines respected him more for standing his ground even with a general. Others thought he was a fool who'd nearly ended his career over pride. His closest friend in the unit, a wiry, fast-talking Marine from Sindh named Faizan Qureshi, found him cleaning his rifle that evening and sat down across from him without asking. "You're an idiot," Faizan said, grinning. "A general, Yar, you grabbed a general." "I know what I did." "I'm not saying you were wrong to stop her. I'm saying only you would manage to be right and still end up looking like a fool." Faizan took the cleaning rod out of Babar's hand and started working on the barrel himself, a small habitual kindness between them that needed no explanation. "You scared, huh?" "No. Liar." Babar almost smiled, a little. "Good," Faizan said, "means you're still human under all that rulebook." 3 weeks passed in the ordinary rhythm of coastal duty, patrol rotations, equipment checks, the long hours of watching empty water that made some men careless and others, like Babar, more careful than ever. The general's visit became old news, a story other units would tell for laughs long after Babar had forgotten the exact shape of his own embarrassment. Then the radio traffic changed. Intelligence had picked up chatter near the creek mouths east of Korangi, the same area General Raza had mentioned in her office, fishing boats moving at hours when no fishermen moved, lights cut at the exact distance where patrol radar lost resolution in the haze. Nothing confirmed, nothing that justified a full alert. But enough that General Raza ordered a personal inspection of the eastern outposts, the kind of visit she liked to make without ceremony, in the same plain field jacket she'd worn the night Babar threw her out of the mess hall. Babar's section was rotated to the Korangi checkpoint 2 days before her arrival, an outpost little more than a raised concrete platform, a watchtower, and a stretch of mangrove mudflat that flooded twice a day with the tide. Faizan came with him. So did 4 others, including a young recruit named Imran who had been in uniform less than 6 months and still flinched at every unfamiliar sound the creek made at night. The night General Raza arrived for her inspection, the tide was wrong. Babar noticed it before anyone said a word about smugglers or threats. He'd grown up on a coastline like this one, had spent half his childhood in his father's boat learning the water the way other boys learn cricket scores. The tide that night was coming in faster and higher than the charts predicted, pushed by a wind shifting out of the southwest, the kind of wind his father used to call a thief's wind, because it covered the sound of an engine and hit a boat's wake in the chop. Something's off, Babar said to Faison, standing at the rail of the watch platform as the general's small convoy arrived. 2 jeeps and a handful of officers, including Major Mahbub, who still hadn't quite forgiven Babar for the mess hall, but had stopped looking at him like he was a liability. Of how? The tide's early and the wind's wrong for this time of year. If I wanted to bring a boat in unseen, tonight's the night I'd pick. Faison looked out at the dark water, the mangroves a black smear against a sky just beginning to lose its color. You're not even on duty for water watch tonight. I know. So why are you out here instead of getting some sleep before the general's inspection? Babar didn't answer right away. The truth was he hadn't trusted the rotation roster all week. The way certain names had been quietly shifted, certain patrol times adjusted by someone with reasons nobody explained. It wasn't proof of anything. It was the same instinct that had once told him not to guess about a fishing boat in the fog, and this time, instead of staying silent, he decided to speak. He found Major Mahbub near the jeeps as General Raza walked the perimeter with 2 of her aides, inspecting the checkpoint's sightlines with the same flat, unimpressed calm she'd shown the night Babar tried to throw her out of a mess hall. Sir, Babar said, request permission to speak. Mahbub's eyebrows went up slightly. Go ahead. The tide tonight doesn't match the charts, and the wind's covering engine noise further out than our radar reads clean. If someone wanted to bring something through the creek unseen, this is the kind of night they'd choose. I think the patrol rotation tonight has gaps on the western mudflat that weren't there last week. Mahbub studied him for a long moment, the same kind of look General Raza had given him in her office. You're telling me this because I'd rather be wrong and look foolish than guess and find out later I was right. Babar's voice caught slightly on the word guess. Mahbub didn't know about Rashid. He didn't need to, but something in Babar's face must have told him this wasn't paranoia talking. Show me the western mudflat, Mahbub said. They never reached it. The first shot came from the mangroves, not the water, which was the detail that saved 3 lives that night, because everyone had been watching the creek and nobody had been watching the tree line behind the platform. Babar heard Imran cry out before he understood what was happening, saw the young recruit go down near the generator shed, and then the night broke apart into noise. 3, maybe 4 attackers moving fast through the mangrove roots, using the flooding tide as cover for a boat that had slipped in along the western mudflat exactly where Babar had said the gap would be. It wasn't a smuggling run. It was a strike aimed, Babar would learn only later, at the general's convoy itself, an attempt by a small militant cell with links to coastal trafficking networks to make a statement by killing or capturing a senior officer on her own inspection route. Someone inside the rotation schedule had leaked her movements. That detail would take weeks to untangle, and Babar would not be the one to untangle it, but in the chaos of the first 90 seconds, none of that mattered. What mattered was General Raza standing exposed near the jeeps with 2 aides scrambling for cover and a clear line of fire from the tree line. Babar didn't think, he moved. He hit her low, the same way he'd grabbed her arm outside the mess hall 3 weeks earlier, except this time there was no anger in it, no certainty he was right and she was wrong, just the flat animal need to get her behind the jeep before the next round came. They went down together in the mud, her shoulder hitting the metal frame hard enough that she would carry a bruise for 2 weeks afterward, and Babar covered her with his own body as rounds sparked off the jeep's hood. Stay down, he said, voice raw. I'm aware, she said, just as flat as the night he'd thrown her out, and somewhere underneath the danger, he almost laughed because she still sounded completely unbothered, even with bullets hitting metal 6 inches from her head. Faison was already moving toward the generator shed where Imran had gone down, dragging the young recruit back under cover, returning fire toward the mangroves with the kind of controlled bursts that came from training, not panic. Mahbub was shouting into a radio, calling for the reaction force stationed 2 kilometers up the channel. Babar, still half on top of the general, twisted enough to see the dark shape of a boat sliding along the mudflat exactly where he'd warned it might, exactly where the gap in patrol coverage sat unguarded. They're using the boat as an extraction route, he said. If we don't block the mudflat, whoever's left alive in those trees gets out clean. Then block it, General Raza said. It wasn't an order from a superior. It was a flat statement of fact, the kind that assumed he already knew what to do and simply needed permission to do it. Babar looked at her for half a second, mud on her face, voice still even, and understood that she trusted his read on the water more than she trusted the radar screens back at base. Sir, he said to Mahbub, I need 2 men and the boat at the jetty. If they reach open water with this tide running, we lose them. Mahbub didn't hesitate. Take Qureshi, go. Faison was already moving when Babar called his name. leaving Imran propped against the shed wall, a Marine named Islam pressing a field dressing against the boy's leg. The two of them sprinted for the small patrol launch tied at the jetty's edge, rounds still cracking sporadically from the mangroves as the reaction forces vehicles became visible in the distance, headlights bouncing along the access road. The water in the channel was rougher than it should have been, churned by the wind and the wrong tide, and Babar fought the wheel as Faison crouched at the bow with his rifle steady, watching the dark shape of the smuggler's boat trying to thread between two sandbars that only someone who'd grown up reading this water would recognize in the dark. "They're going to cut through the second channel," Babar shouted over the engine noise. "It's shallower than it looks. If we push them there, they'll ground. And if we're wrong, then we're stuck in the mud with armed men 40 meters away." Babar didn't slow down. "We're not wrong." He angled the launch hard, cutting across the boat's intended path rather than chasing it directly, forcing it toward the shallower channel his father had taught him to read by the color of the water at dusk, lighter where the sand rose close to the surface, darker where the real depth ran true. The smuggler's boat, driven by someone unfamiliar with these particular flats, hit the rising sandbar at speed and lurched sideways, its engine screaming as the propeller caught mud instead of water. What happened in the next 90 seconds Babar would remember in fragments for the rest of his life. Muzzle flashes from the grounded boat, Faison firing back, controlled, precise, the way he always was no matter how loud the world got around him. The launch rocking hard as Babar cut the engine and let momentum carry them broadside, exposing both of them to the grounded boat's fire for 3, 4, 5 seconds too long. Faison went down first. Babar didn't understand what had happened until he turned and saw his friend slumped against the launch's low rail, one hand still gripping his rifle, the other pressed uselessly against his side where the round had caught him just below the vest line. There was no dramatic last word, no slow-motion realization. Just Faison's breath going short and fast, his eyes finding Babar's in the dark with an expression that looked less like fear and more like apology, as if dying were an inconvenience he regretted causing. "Stay with me," Babar said, pressing both hands against the wound, the launch drifting now untended, while the reaction forces boats finally closed the distance and the grounded smugglers, 3 of them, 2 dead and 1 surrendering with his hands raised in the mud, were pulled from the wreck of their own boat. Faison didn't stay. He made it as far as the medevac chopper, conscious the whole ride, joking weakly about how Babar still owed him for cleaning his rifle 3 weeks earlier, and then he stopped joking somewhere over the harbor, and the corpsman's hands went still in a way Babar had seen once before, on a foggy night with Rashid's name in his mouth. Imran survived. The wound to his leg would leave him limping for months, but he survived, would eventually walk without a cane, would tell the story for years afterward of the night the new general nearly died at Korangi Creek. General Raza survived without a scratch beyond the bruise on her shoulder. The strike cell was broken, its surviving member providing intelligence that would unravel 2 more smuggling routes feeding arms along the coast over the following weeks. Faison Qureshi did not survive, and there was no version of that night's ending that changed it. There was no medal ceremony with cameras and applause. General Raza didn't stand in front of the assembled base and call Babar a hero. She came to the small, plain military funeral 3 days later in her dress uniform, stood at the back without announcement, the same way she'd walked into the mess hall weeks earlier, and said nothing to anyone except a few quiet words to Faison's mother, who had traveled from a small town outside Hyderabad and didn't fully understand in that moment that the woman offering condolences was the general her son had died protecting. She found Babar 2 weeks later, not in her office this time, but at the jetty where the patrol launch was tied, the same launch that still had a faint dark stain on its low rail that nobody had quite gotten around to scrubbing clean. "The disciplinary reprimand from the mess hall incident has been removed from your file," she said, standing beside him without ceremony. "Not because of what happened at Korangi Creek, because it should never have been there in the first place. You followed procedure that night. The force you used was excessive, and you'll carry that lesson, but the rest was a general testing a soldier who passed, and I let a bruised ego write it up as something worse than it was." Babar said nothing for a long time, watching the water move against the jetty pilings. "He died because I picked the second channel," he said finally. "If I'd guessed wrong about the tide, we'd never have been close enough." "You didn't guess," she said. "You read the water the way you read everything else carefully because guessing once cost you someone before. That's not the same thing as making a mistake." She paused. "Qureshi didn't die because you were careful, Sheik. He died because 3 men with rifles decided this coastline was worth killing for, and he chose to stand between them and people he'd never met. That's not a debt you owe. That's a debt none of us can ever fully repay, no matter how careful we are afterward." "Doesn't feel like that helps." "It's not supposed to help," she said. "It's supposed to be true." She left him there at the jetty without another word, the way she'd left the mess hall without complaint, and Babar stood a long while longer, watching the tide come in early again, the way it had that night, wondering if he would ever look at this water without seeing Faison's hand pressed against his side. He stayed in the Marines. He didn't ask for a transfer, didn't ask for lighter duty, though General Raza offered it once quietly, and he declined just as quietly. He became, in time, the kind of senior hand younger recruits got assigned to when they first arrived at Manora, the Marine who checked their gear twice, who corrected their watch rotations before mistakes happened instead of after, who never explained why he was so particular about tide charts and wind direction, only that he was, and that arguing with him about it rarely ended well for the recruit. He sent money home every month, on time again once his pay was restored, and Sana finished her 2 years of school and started her pharmacy course the following spring, never fully understanding why her brother went quiet sometimes when she mentioned the sea, or why he kept folded carefully in his wallet behind his identity card a creased photograph of a grinning Marine named Faison Qureshi holding a cleaning rod like a rifle, caught laughing at some joke the photograph couldn't preserve. He still thought sometimes about the woman who had walked out of that mess hall without raising her voice, without complaint, without ever once asking him to apologize for following the rule he'd been given. He never did apologize for the rule. He apologized once quietly for the way he'd grabbed her arm, and she'd accepted it the same way she accepted most things, with a short nod and no further conversation, as though the matter were now closed and didn't need revisiting. What he never resolved, what sat in him the way Rashid's voice had sat in him for 18 months before Korangi Creek, was the question of whether being right about the rule had been worth what following it and then breaking from it to save her had ultimately cost. The chain of command had held, the mission had succeeded, the general was alive, the smuggling cell broken, the coastline safer than it had been in months. And Faison was still gone, and no amount of careful tide reading would ever bring him back across that water. Babar never got an answer he found satisfying. He simply kept doing the work, kept checking the charts, kept teaching young recruits the things his father had taught him about reading a coastline that didn't care whether you were ready for what it asked of you. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me while I was putting it together, that's exactly why I make these. Stay close, subscribe if you haven't, and tell me down in the comments which moment hit you hardest tonight. I'll see you in the next one.